think it's really important that we understand that both teens and adults are turning to self-destructive behavior for a bunch of reasons. Partly, it is an attempt to regulate a sense of dysregulation, their emotional states. These are folks who do not have a good repertoire of healthy resourcing. And so it actually makes sense, and this is not me condoning the behavior in any way, but it does make sense that they need some way to try to regulate and manage the overwhelmed feeling that they are often flooded by and confronted with. And so, unfortunately, the behaviors that they turn to, rather than being genuine acts of self-care, are actually strategies that wind up sort of perpetuating numbing and dissociation. But know that they're engaging in these behaviors because they're genuinely trying to feel better. And I think if you hold that idea clinically, it kind of sets the agenda in a way. And it's a good reminder to us that one of the many things that we need to make sure that we're attending to when we're working with these issues is giving our clients alternative, healthier strategies that can enable them to better navigate and manage emotional overwhelm and flooding and becoming dysregulated. And I'm going to share some strategies with you today. And I'm sure you already have in your own repertoire, in your own clinical repertoire, strategies that you teach your clients, all of which can be applicable to what we're going to be talking about today. So they're looking for ways to try to better regulate. They're looking for ways to comfort and to try to feel better. They're also, I believe, looking for ways to communicate. And often what it is that they're attempting to communicate is what I refer to as a pain narrative. Now, sometimes this is an actual past history, a backstory of trauma, abuse, or neglect. But not everybody who engages in self-destructive behavior has been sexually abused or physically abused or emotionally neglected, although I will tell you percentage-wise, a large percentage have been, but it's not 100%. But I do think that anybody who is engaging in destructive behaviors is walking around with unprocessed, unmetabolized pain. Now, for some people, that pain might be the very challenging milestones and developmental difficulties of being a teenager. It could be that. And for other of our clients, it's because, again, they have this past history of abuse or neglect. So they're looking for ways to both communicate a pain narrative that they often don't have words for. And we'll talk about why that is as we move through the conversation. They're also looking for ways to disconnect or dissociate from the pain that they're feeling. And the pain that they're feeling is not just physical pain. It's definitely also emotional, psychic, somatic pain that so many people walk around with. Again, particularly when their trauma has not been revealed or processed or metabolized in any way. So I just kind of want you to hold that in your peripheral understanding that these are folks who are genuinely looking for ways to do normal, healthy things, right? It's a sign of good mental health, paradoxically, to want to communicate one's narrative, to want to be able to be better at affect regulation, to want to be able to bring comfort and self-soothing. Those are all good goals and good intentions. It's just that, unfortunately, the way in which they go about it often lands them in a place of guilt and shame, and certainly can be very destructive and detrimental to their bodies, to their physical well-being, to their emotional well-being. And so, again, our job, the way I see it, is to give them alternative ways to achieve the very same things that we're talking about. But whenever I work with a client and we begin to unpack and explore the self-destructive behavior that they're engaging in, I always like to do a little bit of psychoeducation. I actually do a lot of psychoeducation. It doesn't mean I spend the whole session where I'm doing all the talking, but I really think that when we can take the struggles that our clients have, the experiences that don't make sense to them, even the cognitions and the behavioral choices that don't make sense to them, and when we can do that psychoeducation so that we can name some of the experience, we can connect the dots, we can help them to make sense out of what they've been struggling with. I think that's hugely important in therapy. And it also helps to begin to move our clients from that place of guilt and shame and confusion. And frankly, that kind of lands them in a feeling of, I must be crazy, or I'm damaged, or I'm broken. Not unusual for these folks to have those kinds of cognitions. When we do the psychoeducation and we're able to shift them to an understanding, a genuine understanding of here's what you're doing and here's why you're doing it, that very dramatically moves them away from I am crazy. And we want to move our clients away from I am crazy. I am very strongly of the belief that particularly for trauma survivors, they kind of walk through life with their own DSM. We as mental health providers have a huge DSM. I've gone on record many times in many trainings, recorded trainings saying, I hate the DSM. It's actually the most pathologizing piece of literature that's out there. There's no mention of resilience. There's no focus on client strength. It's really completely focused on what's wrong with the client. So whenever I can get away with not leaning into the DSM, I will do my best to not be held hostage to it. But I do think it's a very poignant thing to recognize that trauma survivors have their own DSM. It's much, much smaller. It's about 7 diagnoses. And they may not overtly articulate this, but again, in my 40 years of private practice, when I check this out, I get a resounding yes every time I ask. And those diagnoses include things like I am bad, I'm dirty, I'm damaged, I'm broken, I'm crazy, I'm weird, I'm abnormal, right? That's sort of how they make sense out of why they've been cutting their body for 10 years or why they binge, on 3,000 calories and then make themselves throw up all night long. They don't look at their own behavior through this pain narrative or through this trauma-informed lens. They do not connect what they're doing to prior experiences that have actually kind of set the stage almost inevitably for them to need to turn to destructive behaviors because, again, they don't have anything healthy in their coping strategy repertoire. So the psychoeducation, and everything that I share with you, you can take back and obviously using language that is age appropriate and resonates for your client's cognitive level of functioning, but never shy away from providing that psychoeducation. I think we get very caught up in the kind of sort of sexy and creative treatment modalities that we're going to bring into the work. And there are some modalities, as we'll talk about, that can be quite beneficial and quite effective. But I really think that things like psychoeducation and the establishment of a very safe and non-judgmental therapeutic relationship can go an incredibly long way in creating a safe context so that then the modalities that you want to bring in can be more effective. And for me, psychoeducation is a modality. And so it is something that I just want to kind of empower you to continue to bring to the work that you do. So with that in mind, the very first piece of psychoeducation that I always start with, whether I'm training mental health providers or I'm talking to my clients, is to make the connection between our earliest experiences with attachment and how that connects to affect regulation versus affect dysregulation. Affect dysregulation meaning the inability to navigate and to manage your different emotional states. And if you land in that place of affect dysregulation, that creates tremendous vulnerability to then almost need to lean into strategies for coping and surviving that tend to be highly numbing and dissociative. And again, do not expect your clients to be able to recognize those 3 pieces on their own. This is something I think that becomes very valuable for you to kind of walk them through. And I'm going to demonstrate sort of how to walk them through it in the way that I'm going to walk you through it. And so I always like to start by letting my clients know that when we first come into the world, the single most important developmental task that we must resolve is attachment. And we have to attach because we come into the world as completely dependent beings, right? We're really totally at the mercy of our caretakers. Everything we need for our literal survival comes from attachment to other. So this is a biological imperative that every infant must in some way resolve. And then I like to remind my clients of the 4 basic attachment patterns that all of us potentially got exposed to in our family of origin relationships with our primary caretakers. Now, this is not new stuff, looking at the 4 basic attachment patterns, but honestly, this works. I don't believe in reinventing the wheel when what we have already totally captures what we're looking for in terms of attachment patterns. And so if you're old enough to know the work of John Bowlby or Mary Ainsworth, Main and Solomon, these were the folks really starting in the late 60s into the 70s and the 80s who did this brilliant job of conceptualizing the four main attachment patterns that a child is likely, one of the four, that a child is likely to receive from their primary caretaker. Now, obviously, the gold standard is secure attachment. And I think it's important to say that every infant who comes into the world deserves and needs secure attachment. But the reality is that just about 50% of infants and children growing up in family systems are actually getting the secure attachment that they need, which is pretty devastating when you think about it, because not getting secure attachment, as we'll talk about, has very profound and lifelong consequences for people as they evolve through different developmental stages. So when we have secure attachment, the easiest way to describe this, to your clients is that the parent or the caretakers, whoever the primary caretakers are, they are available emotionally, they're present, they are genuinely and sincerely interested in meeting their child's needs, they are attuned to the child's emotions. And here's a piece that none of the researchers actually wrote about, but I've learned over the years becomes very important to ask about, because it's not just about a parent who is attuned and connected. The piece that I think is a little bit sort of more implicit and less obvious, but equally formative, is were you made to feel guilty for having the needs that you had? And so I invite you to include that in whatever assessment you're doing, putting your client into a family of origin dynamic, which I hope that you do, is to ask not only about were your parents present, were they available, do they meet your needs, but were you ever made to feel guilty for having the needs that you have? Because there are many kids who grow up in families where if they fall and if they start to cry, the parent might come to them, but the parent might then say to them, be a man, you're 3. And they're saying, be a man and stop crying, or you don't need to, or I'll give you something to cry about, right? So that's not secure attachment, obviously. So with secure attachment, there's this extraordinary feeling of safety. There's an extraordinary feeling of being seen, heard, and understood. And I've always said as a trauma therapist that it's one of the single most important needs. It does not have to only be met in early childhood. The truth is, oftentimes that need gets met for our clients in the therapeutic relationship, right? And for many of our clients, the therapeutic relationship is so powerful and so important because it is the first time in their life that they feel seen, heard, and understood. But those are part of the ingredients that we look for and listen for when we're assessing for secure attachment. So the folks who are engaging in self-destructive behavior, by and large, are not the folks who were securely attached. Because if you're securely attached, you'll see what that inevitably leads to are good affect regulation skills. We internalize the way in which our caretakers respond to our emotional needs. And what starts out as our parent's voice becomes our own voice in our head, right? And if the parent is modeling our right to be nurtured and held and soothed and comforted, we're going to internalize those experiences. And over time, the child is going to be able to actually begin to do a very primitive but useful and powerful version of that for themselves. So the people that we're talking about in this workshop, where we're looking at folks who engage in self-destructive behavior, I'm going to tell you overwhelmingly have really received one of the other 3 attachment patterns that you see on the slide. And those are dismissive, ambivalent, or disorganized. So I'm just going to very quickly kind of walk through each of those. I appreciate that for a lot of you, you already know this. This may just be review. But what I've noticed over the years is that not a lot of clinicians necessarily know to attach the whole concept of attachment to self-destructive behavior. And so that's a piece that might be a little bit new for you to bring to your work, but incredibly valuable and really sets the stage for helping the client to make sense out of the subsequent struggles that they experienced.